Lesson 3. Unity and Sectionalism. It matters because, although national pride was evident throughout the country, each region, north, south, and west, wanted to further its own economic and political interests. National unity. Guiding question. How did the country change after the War of 1812? With the end of the War of 1812, the intense divisions that once split the nation seemed gone. In their place was a feeling of unity. In the 1816 presidential election, James Monroe, the Republican candidate, faced no serious opposition. The Federalists, weakened by doubts about their loyalty during the war, barely survived as a national party. Monroe won the election by an overwhelming margin. A Boston newspaper called this time the era of good feelings. The new president was a living, breathing symbol of this mood. Monroe had been involved in national politics since the American Revolution. He wore breeches or knee-high pants and powdered wigs, styles no longer in fashion. Yet with his sense of dignity, Monroe represented a united country, free of political strife. Outgoing President James Madison's last message to Congress in 1817 expressed a growing nationalism, or strong loyalty to the nation. The War of 1812 had made clear that Jefferson's ideal of a limited central government could not meet the needs of a nation in times of crisis. Sounding more like a Federalist than a Republican, Madison urged the federal government to guide the growth of trade and industry. The large Republican majority in Congress agreed. The Republicans, who had once strongly supported states' rights, now promoted federal power. Henry Clay's American System. Henry Clay, a Republican and Speaker of the House, proposed a nationalist program to help the nation grow. Clay's American System aimed to help the economy in each section of the country and increase the power of the federal government. Clay called for higher tariffs, a new Bank of the United States, and internal improvements, including the building of roads, bridges, and canals. Not all congressional leaders agreed with Clay, and they did not accept all of his ideas. Congress did not spend much money on internal improvements, but other parts of the American system did become law. The Second Bank of the United States. The charter for the First Bank of the United States expired in 1811, and Congress let the bank die. In 1816, the Republican majority in Congress brought the national bank back to life. President Madison signed the bill creating the Second Bank of the United States. After the first bank closed, many state banks had acted unwisely. They made too many loans and allowed too much money into circulation. These actions led to inflation, a rise in the prices of goods. As prices rose, American families could buy less and less with each dollar. The absence of a national bank also meant the federal government had no safe place to keep its funds. The Second Bank of the United States restored order to the money supply, helping American businesses to grow. Competition from Britain. Another challenge facing the economy was a flood of British goods following the War of 1812. British factories often had more advanced technology and methods than American factories. The British turned out goods of higher quality and at a lower price than goods made in the United States. Naturally, buyers preferred these goods. By flooding the United States with their goods, the British hoped to keep American businesses from competing. New tariffs. American manufacturers called for high tariffs to protect their growing industries. To address this problem, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816. Unlike earlier revenue tariffs, which were meant to provide income for the federal government, this tariff was designed to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition by placing high taxes on imports. Merchants who paid the tariff on imported goods simply added the cost of the tariff to their prices. This made imported items more expensive for consumers and encouraged them to buy cheaper, American-made goods. When Congress passed protective tariffs in 1818 and 1824, that were even higher than the tariff of 1816, some Americans protested. Southerners were especially angry. They felt that the tariff protected northern manufacturers at their expense. The South had few factories, so people there saw little benefit from high tariffs. What the southern states did see were higher prices for the goods they had to buy. Growing sectionalism. The tariff dispute illustrated a growing sectionalism, differences in the goals and interests of different parts of the country. Such differences had existed since colonial times. Now, it seemed, they were growing sharper. In fact, they soon brought an end to the era of good feelings. In the early 1800s, three distinct sections developed in the United States: the North, the South, and the West. The North included New England and the mid-Atlantic states. The South covered what is now the Southeast. The West included the area between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Geography, economics, and history all contributed to sectional differences and differing ways of life in the United States. As the differences grew deeper, however, people began to wonder whether sectionalism might divide the nation. Each section of the country had a strong voice in Congress in the early 1800s. Henry Clay of Kentucky represented the West. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina spoke for Southern interests. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts protected the interests of New England. Each leader, although nationalist, remained concerned with protecting the interests of his own section of the country. Nationalism and the Supreme Court. In three decisions in the early 1800s, the Supreme Court backed the powers of the national government over the states. During this time, Chief Justice John Marshall provided strong leadership. In the case of Fletcher versus Peck in 1810, the court ruled that courts could declare acts of a state government void if they violated provisions of the Constitution. Then, in 1819, the court decided the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. It said that the state of Maryland could not tax the local office of the Bank of the United States because it was the property of the national government. Allowing such a tax, the court said, would give states too much power over the national government. The court also ruled that the national bank was constitutional, even though the Constitution did not specifically give Congress the power to create a bank. Marshall observed that the Constitution specifically gave Congress power to issue money, borrow money, and collect taxes. Congress could also, he reasoned, do whatever was necessary and proper to carry out those powers. In 1824, the court again ruled in favor of federal government power in Gibbons versus Ogden. The state of New York had granted a monopoly, sole control of an industry, to a steamship operator running ships between New York and New Jersey. Under New York's law, no other operator could run steamboats on the same route. The Supreme Court said that only Congress had the power to make laws governing interstate commerce, or trade between states. Missouri statehood. In 1819, the Missouri Territory asked Congress for admission as a state. Most Missouri settlers had come from Kentucky and Tennessee, which allowed slavery. They believed slavery ought to be legal in Missouri. Representative James Talmadge proposed that Missouri gradually abolish slavery in order to be admitted to the Union. The House passed this plan, but the Senate blocked it. At the time, the population in the North was slightly larger than in the slave states of the South. Consequently, the North had 105 members in the House of Representatives compared to the South's 81 members. Representation in the Senate was balanced with 11 slave states and 11 free states. The addition of Missouri as a free state would put the South in the minority in both houses of Congress. The Missouri Compromise. Debates in Congress heated to the boiling point. Fearing a split in the Union, Henry Clay suggested the Missouri Compromise. Clay proposed that Maine, in the Northeast, enter the Union as a free state. Missouri could then enter as a slave state. This would keep an even balance of power in the Senate, 12 free states and 12 slave states. The Missouri Compromise also addressed the question of slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory. The compromise drew a line west from the southern boundary of Missouri at 36 degrees 30 feet north latitude. The compromise blocked slavery north of the line but permitted it south of the line. The Missouri Compromise promised a temporary solution to sectional conflict. It did nothing to solve the basic problem, however. Americans who moved west took their different ways of life with them. White Southerners wanted to take an economy based on slavery to their new homes. Northerners believed in labor by free people and wanted to establish that in the West. It was a disagreement that seemed to have no peaceful solution. Progress check. Explaining. Describe how the Supreme Court's decisions affected the power of the federal government. Thinking like a historian. Understanding cause and effect. The varying views toward tariffs in different regions of the country were the result of each region's unique economy. The South, for example, not only purchased manufactured goods from foreign nations, its planters also sold crops overseas. In addition to raising costs for Southern consumers, a protective tariff threatened to hurt foreign consumers of Southern cotton, and so the Southern planters themselves. Foreign affairs. Guiding question. How did the United States define its role in the Americas? The War of 1812 heightened Americans' pride in their country. Americans also realized that the United States had to establish a new relationship with the Old World, the powers of Europe. Relations with Britain. In the 1817 Rush-Bagot Agreement, the United States and Britain agreed to limit the number of armed naval vessels on the Great Lakes. Each country was to take apart or destroy other armed ships on the Great Lakes. The Convention of 1818 set the northern boundary of the Louisiana Territory between the United States and Canada at the 49th parallel. The convention also created a secure border. Each country agreed to maintain its border without armed forces. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams also negotiated the right of Americans to settle in the Oregon Country. Relations with Spain. Spain owned the colonies of East Florida and West Florida. In 1810, American settlers in West Florida rebelled against Spanish rule. The United States government then argued that West Florida was included in the Louisiana Purchase. In 1810 and 1812, the United States took control of sections of West Florida. The territory claimed by the United States reached west to the borders of Louisiana and Mississippi. Spain objected to losing part of West Florida, but took no action against the United States. Native Americans living in Spanish East Florida sometimes raided American settlements in Georgia. General Andrew Jackson was ordered to stop these Seminole raids. Jackson believed his order included pursuing the Seminoles into the Florida colonies. In the spring of 1818, another general, William McIntosh, led Creek Indian allies against the Seminoles in Georgia. Meanwhile, Jackson followed fleeing Seminoles into Spanish West Florida. After pursuing the Seminoles, Jackson and his troops moved farther into West Florida. There they seized the Spanish forts at Pensacola and San Marcos. Secretary of State Adams had not authorized Jackson's actions, but he did nothing to stop them or to punish Jackson. Jackson's raid demonstrated American military strength compared to that of Spain. Secretary of State Adams believed that the Spanish did not want war and wanted to settle the dispute. Adams was correct, and with the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, Spain ceded, or gave up control of, all claims and ownership to both East and West Florida. They also gave up claims to Oregon Country in the Pacific Northwest, while the United States agreed to Spanish control of Texas. Spain loses power. Meanwhile, Spain was losing power elsewhere in its vast empire. In 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo led a rebellion in Mexico. Hidalgo called for racial equality and the redistribution of land. The Spanish captured and executed Hidalgo, but by 1821, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain. Simon Bolivar, also known as the Liberator, led the independence movement that won freedom for the present-day countries of Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, Bolivia, and Ecuador. José de San Martín successfully achieved independence for Chile and Peru. By 1824, Spain had lost control of most of South America. The Monroe Doctrine. In 1822, 4 European nations, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, discussed a plan to help Spain regain its American holdings. The possibility of increased European involvement in the Americas troubled President Monroe. There were also concerns about Russia's intentions for controlling land in the Northwest. The president issued a statement on December 2, 1823. The United States would not get involved in the internal affairs or wars in Europe. It also would not interfere with any existing European colonies in the Americas. At the same time, the statement said, North and South America are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. The Monroe Doctrine, as the statement came to be known, served as a clear warning to European nations to keep out of the Americas. It became a guiding force in American foreign policy in the decades ahead.